I talked with a few interesting people out west, and I want to sound you out about your perspectives on
Uh-huh.
it. Okay, one guy is Leonard Dinnerstein. He
Hmm.
gave me 4 hours, believe it or not. He's retired though.
Yes.
And the interesting, he did a book called Anti-Semitism in America,
Right.
and we talked and talked and talked and talked, and somehow the subject came up, and he talked quite a bit. He's very frank. He's as he called himself, a stereotypical New York Jew with that kind of I don't care about anything, I'm frank attitude. He talked about the terms goy and shiksa, schwarze, goyischer Kopf, all this stuff, and with how and underscoring with frankness the categorical dismissal of all that. And so the thing that interested me,
Of the concepts or them?
the concepts, the idea in Yiddish culture, it's a complete negation, and he was emphatic about that. It's like pejorative.
Yeah.
So, but the paradox for me was he was speaking about, he's an expert on anti-Semitism, so the kind of hostility going to the Jews is that way. But no one hears, and there's a rationale why I asked him about it, why the Jews had their own version of the same thing in terms.
Right.
And what's your take on that? I know what he said, but what's your sense of that?
Well, traditionally, I think there has been that, and where that comes from, it could come from. Where do you want me to look, by the way?
Just towards me is fine.
Towards you, yeah. Traditionally, there has been us and them, and where that originates is a question. It could have originated partly within the Jewish stream, isolating, looking out. It probably happened with both sides, but there is an established sense of us and them. It collapses some, it comes back. Again, it revolves around the question of Jewish distinctiveness ultimately, which is an essential core of what it means to be Jewish.
Well, his kind of base for understanding all that, and I think a lot of members of the Jewish community, their base for understanding is, well, what was that?
Can you hand me my iPhone? I'll turn it off.
His basic understanding is that it's a reaction to Christian hostility to the Jews, and that's very common.
Yes, I think that's a common reaction. Where it all started, uh, I don't think we really know, but certainly the Christian hostility toward Jews deepened it. Whether there was Jewish participation in it as well, that's discussed.
Okay. I interviewed a guy, also the regional director for Jews for Jesus, and I want to sound you out about some stuff because you've done a lot of work on Christianity, and
Mm-hmm.
you've been around the block on that. And judging from what he says, and again, and what I've read, is there's an immense hostility to them from the mainstream Jewish community.
Right.
And in Israel, there are arguably pogroms. There are violent attacks by the Orthodox.
Mm.
There's murders, bombs, all sorts of things. Could you address that? Especially in terms of the Jewish mainstream community here? I mean, that guy is really condemned, and those people. I mean, could you address that kind of tension again? What's that all about?
Well, there's more hostility toward Jews for Jesus than there would be, sometimes I think, launching a nuclear weapon into Cairo. So it's interesting why there's so much hostility about it, and there certainly is. And I think it has to do with this distinctiveness, and maybe Jews are so upset with Jews for Jesus because there really isn't that much distinctiveness anymore. It has to do with the boundary setting and a feeling of betrayal, but obviously Jews for Jesus are Jewish as well. But you're right, there is a great hostility toward it, and I think often a misplaced one.
Okay. And where the origins of that? Can you speculate on?
Between Judaism and Christianity, and the struggle over the millennia and the violence that Christians have perpetrated against Jews, and the attempt to expropriate Jewishness for themselves, and then you have Jews who want to do that too. So it's not complete. It's not rational. It's not irrational. It has to do with history, but the hostility is way over the top, and you have to ask yourself why there's more hostility toward Jews for Jesus than what we're doing as Jews to the Palestinian people. That doesn't seem to raise that banner at all. So maybe it's an attempt to deflect from the reality of what's going on. But it's historical, boundary setting, But where you set your boundaries is important. And the boundaries don't seem to be set in terms of our injustice toward others.
Is part of this betrayal, the idea that...
Yes.
Because I guess what I want to throw out to you is, again, the issue of where anti-Semitism comes from. If it's, some argue it's Christian-based, the modern version of it. Yet these guys, I talked to this one particular guy, and there's an argument that initially it was the Christians who were persecuted and the Jews were the dominant force. And could you get into that?
Well, there have been times in history where Jews have been dominant, and probably dealt with the less dominant in similar ways that we've been dealt with. But we don't look at that part of our history. We have a certain narrative of Jewish history, especially in the West, and it has to do with Jews being oppressed and Christians being oppressors. That narrative remains dominant, even though now we're not oppressed. And again, you have to ask yourself, why would you keep a narrative of oppression when you're not being oppressed? And maybe that's, again, a desire or a need to be seen as distinctive, but also unaccountable for what we're actually doing now. So we're against the myth of what we were doing. Of course, that's right. But we may actually be doing things now that we need to be held accountable for. If we can keep the mythic sense of what Jews have done out of it, then we can be released from the accountability.
The lachrymose so-called theory of Jewish history, the idea that Jews are always persecuted and all that. Could you discuss how deeply that informs modern Jewish identity?
I think very much. I think that's a general sense that Jews have been oppressed. Partially true, not completely true. And that we now have power which isn't really power because we're always oppressed. And since we've been oppressed, and since we couldn't have a power that oppresses, therefore we're not oppressing another people. It's a logic that is in history but needs to be questioned.
Out of one of your books, you say this, just a quick quote, please. You say, by being brutally honest about the change Jews have undergone, the movement from being victims to being the oppressor, Edward Said challenges Jews to live up to their own values or drop the moral facade and argue simply from the perspective of raw power. Could you elaborate on that? That's from your... Well, these are out of context, I'm sorry, but you know what
it doesn't matter. I mean, it's all right. Yeah. We don't seem to be able to say as a community that we have power and we're going to use it any way we see fit. We do that, but we don't admit to others that we do it, and we don't admit to ourselves that we do it. So my challenge is, if we need power and we want to use that power in whatever way we want to use it, fair enough. Say it. Don't put a moral victimhood around it. But we can't, because there's no way to explain Jewishness in history. And Jewishness has never been explained in history without there being something special about being Jewish. And that being special has never been, at least in our minds, or articulated as oppressing another people. So if we admit that we're just like any other people, when we have power, we'll use it in whatever way we want to. We can't admit it because then we would have the question, what does it mean to be Jewish? We have to have a reason for using power which disguises that use. Now, every group that uses power always has reasons for using it, and they always claim innocence. So we're not alone in that, but there's a distinctive Jewish way of doing it. So, for instance, Palestinians couldn't be simply opposing our power against them. They have to be opposed to Jews in general. And you cannot convince a Jew, or most Jews, that Palestinians might actually simply have a political beef with Jews, like other people might have a political beef with other people. It has to be anti-Semitism.
In your view, how large, how much support is there in the Jewish community for Israel? And that's loosely what does it mean by support? But who are basically either active, really strongly active, or loosely active, but are your nemesis, say? What can you give an idea on how widespread is its support?
I think it's an ideology and it's a projection rather than a deep support. I don't think there's a negation of it. Most Jews have never been to Israel. Most Jews don't know anything about Israel. Most Jewish leaders don't know anything about Israel either. That's my view. But it doesn't seem to matter. It's a symbol for American Jews. And that symbol is important to us. If Israel has to suffer or Israelis have to die for it, that's a different story. That's not us.
What is your status in the Jewish community? I mean, for you say a lot of things that are I can see what they'd be pissed off the Jewish community. So what's your status? How do you function with two?
Well, I've been on the board of the Society of Jewish Ethics. I've been asked to lecture in Israel. I've been published in anthologies of Jewish literature. I'm also denigrated. I think it's very mixed.
Okay. Would you discuss you say this, Jews feel that the entire history of Christianity, at least insofar as it relates to Jews, must be exposed and acknowledged. And you talk at length about the interfaith dialogues, and basically, I think, as I recall, your position is that they're very one-sided, and that the Christian community is basically pretty docile and follow up in supporting Israel without criticism.
Or they simply leave the dialogue, which is what's happened now.
Could you just elaborate on all that?
Oh yes, I mean the idea that Christians are going to commemorate the Holocaust forever, and Holocaust memorialization is wrong. They're leaving in droves. Now they usually don't say it up front why they're leaving, but they're leaving because it doesn't make any sense anymore, because we're commemorating Jewish victimhood, but we're creating victims, and we won't acknowledge that. So the ecumenical dialogue, as we have known it, has been over for decades. And the ecumenical deal, where Jews lecture Christians and Christians are silent about Israel, lest they be seen as anti-Semitic, is effectively over. Nobody's talking about it.
Nobody's talking about the fact that it's over?
Right. It's just, you can see it ending.
Okay. You say this too. The way forward for the Jewish community within is paradoxically outside. One searches in vain to find any Jewish institutional framework that combines this internal search within the larger non-Jewish community of seekers and activists. So you position yourself as an outsider. I guess you are. Could you elaborate on that? That at least when you wrote this, there was no framework by which a guy like you could have any kind of...
Really, in general, there's no framework. Jews who search for justice search outside of the Jewish community. There's no institutional framework that will contain and promote the critique that Jews of conscience have. And therefore, there's no future for that Jewishness that won't listen to and won't be warned by this critique.
You talk somewhat about the Holocaust narrative enshrined in the museum on the Mall, one in Washington D.C. And you say it itself is an expression of that empowerment, the museum itself. Could you elaborate on that? Why that thing is there and what it means?
Well, it's interesting. It's the only, as far as I know, the only institution on the Mall at the capital of the United States that's about an event that didn't happen in the United States.
And so where does that come from? Why is it there?
That's a good question. Jewish empowerment and the Jewish sense that this is our story. Now, there should be a museum about Jews on the Mall, but why isn't it about Jewish history, about American Jewish history? Why is it about the Holocaust only? It's fascinating. You have to think about it. It's because Jews of this generation who have connections and wealth and are part of the Jewish establishment feel that that's the story that has to be told about Jews in America. But you have to ask how that functions. What does that say about Jews? And of course, the There were over 2 million visitors, I believe, last year that came to that museum. So the visitors have to be overwhelmingly non-Jewish. What are they learning about Jewish history? And why does the Jewish community want them to learn that part of Jewish history to the exclusion of other parts? The Holocaust functions as a source of Jewish empowerment in the United States.
Elaborate on that.
The museum is a form of Jewish empowerment. It features the Holocaust. It means we use the Holocaust as a way of raising our status and our power in America.
And how does this feed into support for Israel, or does it?
Well, it does, because if you listen to the story of the Holocaust, how could you not support the state of Israel? If you listen to the story of the Holocaust and you don't support the state of Israel, you must be an anti-Semite.
You say this too. You say a lot of interesting things. The fear is simple. If the sole content of Jewish identity revolves around the purity of the Holocaust in Israel and suffering and innocence, then the confession of culpability introduces a dissonance that threatens the entire identity structure. Could you elaborate on that?
Right, at the heart of Jewish identity in America is that we're better than others, we're just, we're good, and we're innocent. And we have suffered. If you factor in the fact that we are not always innocent, that we do have power, that sometimes we use our power for bad things as well as good things, it gets very confusing, especially when others begin to feel and say that. They reflect back who we are really. But Jewish identity isn't based on who we are really. It's based on a conceptual understanding of Jewishness, which in America is about Jews as innocent, good, and just. We are, but not always.
You say, there's another quote. You say, you went on a delegation to Auschwitz years ago.
Yeah.
You discussed that. And then you say, when you were there, this is where I began to see more clearly that the contemporary form of Jewish orthodoxy revolves less around God than it does around the Holocaust. Could you discuss that?
I'd say that the central aspects of Jewish religiosity today among most Jews is the Holocaust and the state of Israel. Those are where we have our devotions, our loyalties, our energies, our intellect, our money, our lobbying. All of that has to revolve around the Holocaust in Israel, and therefore, since they're the most important to us, they're the center of our religion, and they become almost like gods. Therefore, if you dispute the Holocaust-Israel axis, you're a heretic.
What's your take on those individuals called Holocaust deniers?
They're idiots.
You elaborate?
Well, I think Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism.
Okay, how and why? How does?
It's a way of hitting at Jews.
Elia Wiesel, however you
Yeah,
pronounce
right.
it. Could you discuss his relationship to the Holocaust and the museum, modern Israel, his importance in the Jewish community?
Well, his importance is huge. He's an icon. And he has spoken and written movingly about the Holocaust, but he's also more or less silent about Palestinians. And so he has been made an icon, and he's also been silent. Therefore, he was oppressed, and now he's culpable.
Okay.
And in that way, as a Jewish leader, he's failed.
You talk about Cudahy, John Cudahy.
John Murray Cudahy.
Okay. And he brings up Freud, Marx, and Levi Strauss, and the so-called, quote, subversive aspect of them in deconstructing the civilization, what have you. What's your take on that in terms of the Jewish presence and the Jewish identity that feeds those guys, and being a force to deconstruct existing society?
Yes, I mean, if you take Jewish intellectuals in general, but obviously Freud, Marx, Levi Strauss, these are the most known, but Jewish intellectuals in general, have, in most of the 20th century, been intellectuals who deconstruct prevailing orthodoxies in terms of sociology, philosophy, theology, great deconstructors. And part of that is to make a way for Jews to be part of the conversation, sometimes to dominate the conversation. But the one part we don't deconstruct is our own Jewishness. And so there's a deconstruction of Christianity, which has been important for Christians, to reevaluate what it means to be a Christian. But we don't allow a deconstruction of Jewishness, that is, to look at the colonial and imperial elements within our own Jewishness. That's not allowed. So Jewish intellectuals have been dominant, and a lot of it has been very, very important and good. But we've used that dominance to close down the questions about ourselves. And most of Jewish intellectual life today is not about deconstructing or reconstructing. It's about deflecting opposition to Jewish policies in Israel and Palestine. So it's become, instead of a subverter of orthodoxy, it has become a purveyor of orthodoxy and a censoring of other views, including views of other kinds of Jews, Jews of conscience.
And how would you define them?
Jews of conscience are those Jews who say that we need to deconstruct the Jewishness which is received as established and authentic because, among other things, it is enabling unjust power over the Palestinians.
You talk about Kodahi at length, and you also say this. Kodahi, the presumption of total... this is the contemporary theodicy of the Jewish people according to Kodahi, the presumption of total innocence in historical and contemporary matters. In this way, public cavelling and sanctimonious moralizing comes to be seen by non-Jews as a strategy for avoiding accountability. That's what he says, but you discuss it at length. Could you talk about that a little bit?
No, I think the projection of Jewish innocence today is a way of, and suffering, is a way of forcing others to back off. So we declare our territory, and we also declare what other people's territories can be. So it's not an equal exchange. Now, we've suffered unequal exchanges in the past. We assert the need for equality in exchanges, but actually it's a form of dominance. And therefore, we want to make sure that what's ever said about Jews is controlled by us, including controlling what some Jews of conscience say about Jewish identity and power.
Okay, I've talked to someone, I think it was Dinnerstein, he talked about how many Jewish scholars actually control, not to use the word control, but say African Americans. The discourse about, scholarly discourse about African Americans is largely Jewish. Same thing with the Palestinians, he argued, that, you know, the Palestinian discourse is largely centered. You touched on that thing you said before. Could you elaborate on that? The kind of power to...
Right. We have demanded the power to narrate our story, and we had every right to demand that. After all, our story was narrated by Christians for almost 2 millennia in a very oppressive way. But in our narrating our own story, we've also insisted on narrating other people's stories. And that became an issue in the African American civil rights and for Palestinians. We want to speak for everyone. It's a way of controlling what is said about Jews.
Could you elaborate? Do you have much knowledge of the classical tensions between... let's see. Between... Make sure that's good. Okay. Between the black community, the African American community, and the Jewish community. There's been all sorts of tensions over the years. Could you elaborate on your...
Well, the civil rights movement, Black Power movement, these all became places where Jews and African Americans interacted, and there was an intimate interaction, but of course Jews had the upper hand in America. Jews helped finance the civil rights movement. Jewish lawyers were involved. This was all good in terms of being generous, but African Americans also wanted to define themselves, and so there was this tension which is ongoing. In the one way, it's a terrible split. In another way, it's inevitable. But in the end, when it came for Jews of whether to support African Americans and let them speak for themselves, or support African Americans and let Jews also speak for African Americans, we chose the latter. And if we weren't going to be able to control the discussion, we left.
The NAACP, I've heard that there was a strong Jewish presence in that.
Of course, there was a strong Jewish presence, financially and otherwise, in terms of leadership for a long time. This was good because Jews were speaking where blacks couldn't speak at the time. But there was also a resentment because Jewish speech couldn't substitute for African American speech. There was a clash. It's understandable. There were two minorities, one empowered or on the way to empowerment, the other way out of American society in terms of power. But in the end, African Americans want to speak for themselves, which is understandable.
I've heard the term by a scholar, a Jewish scholar, talk about anti-Semitism controlled by remote control and using African Americans. Is that too cynical in the civil rights movement that whatever African Americans gained, the Jewish community gained in the background? Is that too cynical, or do you accept that?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
That whatever happened well for the African Americans, also the Jewish community would benefit from.
Well,
the African Americans who were in the foreground all the time in the civil rights battle.
Yeah. Well, Jews benefited from the civil rights movement in many ways. One was it allowed Jews to express their sense of social justice, but also Jews were arguing for a more inclusive society. So the more inclusive the society was, the better it was for Jews. But we could always distinguish ourselves from blacks because we could also eventually pass for whites. So this wasn't conscious, I think, so much, but it caused friction because in the end, Jews weren't perceived in America as people of color. They were perceived as white. African Americans couldn't have that luxury.
I talked to Michael Lerner, and among the things he says is that there has been a resentment, at least it used to be in the Jewish community, by the leftist community, that the liberal community, that the Jewish community is not considered to be minority in the Rainbow Coalition, all that. And there's been tensions between minorities of various sorts and the Jews who you just talked about how they could be considered white and all that. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think Jews who feel they're a minority and arguing for justice, sometimes against the Jewish establishment, want to be accepted as a minority in these movements for justice. But these movements for justice have not wanted many Jewish voices. One, because they do tend to dominate sometimes. And the other reason, I think, a big reason, is that Jews haven't been critical of where we're doing injustice. And for African Americans, the Palestinians have seemed to be very akin to their situation. So part of it is Jewish narrative ability and the desire of others to narrate their own stories. And part of it is the inability of Jewish progressives to actually fess up for what we're doing.
You talked about Cudahy again. You say Cudahy's understanding of Jewish intellectuals as a subversive force in their movement to one of defensive maneuvering is accompanied by his sense that the Jewish use of chosenness, already secularized in the 12th century, etc., in essence, as Said points out, a religious assertion is promulgated with the power of the university, the social sciences, and the state behind it. The idea of chosenness that informs the Holocaust and all that, and then, as you mentioned, Said points out there's a kind of power elite that can push forward this stuff in academia. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think the Holocaust functions as a form of Jewish chosenness in the modern world. You can't really say in most universities we're the chosen people, but the Holocaust is very distinguishing, and the way we teach it is very distinguishing. And I believe in some ways it functions as a disguised and not so disguised discussion of Jews as chosen. So it elevates our status among other peoples And Jews very consciously want that elevation, and historically have always sought that elevation. And that in itself isn't a problem, but when combined with power, it becomes a problem. When you're out of power, Jewish chosenness is a way for the community to assert its dignity. When you have power, that assertion of chosenness is usually over against others.
And this has a religious dimension. Could you elaborate on
I
that?
think it's religious, yes, because the Holocaust in Israel is the religion of American Jews. And therefore, it's very important that the Holocaust in Israel be seen as distinctive, good, and innocent.
During your delegation, or you speak about Joey and Rose in one
Yes.
of your books, and you talk about, in essence, you say Rose thought that the delegation, or at least the most vocal of the group, were using the Holocaust as a sign of superiority and suffering, even though the majority of delegates lived in a manner that to most Polish people was affluent and unattainable. Though she had lost distant relatives in the Holocaust, Rose found many of the delegates to be smug and uncritical of their own attitudes and place in the world. Rose wondered how these men, so sure of themselves and angry at the world, could create a future for the Jewish people or be contributors to the larger project of life behind the Jewish world. So could you address that kind of paradox of the kinds of people who are calling the shots on all this stuff?
Sure, we have Jewish elites holding up Jewish suffering in history as the suffering, and really as the only suffering worthy of mention or study, while tremendous numbers of people are suffering who are not Jewish. How does that look to them? And how does that look to Jewish dissidents that say, well, we did suffer, but we're not suffering now, and look at all these other people suffering. Why do we insist on being the center of the story now when others should be? So the conclusion is that Jillian had, and I have in some ways, is that we use it. It functions as a way of asserting our innocence and unaccountability, and therefore retaining our power over others, which many Jews don't want. We want something different.
You talk about what you call a civil war within the Jewish community, the Jews of conscience and the Jewish establishment being primary elements, I guess. But could you elaborate on this civil war? I mean, most Americans who are not Jewish haven't a clue.
Well, there's a civil war between what I call Constantinian Jews, this Jewish establishment, and progressive Jews, and I believe they're on the same sides. They're what I call empire Jews, and they use the Jewish story to narrate our innocence and redemption in somewhat different ways. Then we have Jews of conscience that say the war that they think they're having, that is, Constantinian Jews, the Jewish establishment, and progressive Jews, isn't a war at all. It's a mutual entanglement, and we need something else. Something has gone very wrong in Jewish life, Jews of conscience say, and we need to move beyond this false civil war between the Jewish establishment and progressive Jews. We need to move somewhere else. Now, these Jews of conscience that say that are persecuted by progressive Jews as well.
You write a lot about Christianity and liberation theology, and that Mary Noel, you were part of them or something at some point.
Well, I was
Could
teaching
you elaborate? How did all that experience, that brand of Christian experience, inform you in your Jewish identity? It seems to come out. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I experienced large parts of the world that Jews don't live in. And large parts of them are very poor and struggling. So as the Jewish world has become more and more isolated, narrowed, basically to Israel and the United States, some of Europe, I was traveling the world and seeing suffering in the present. Our suffering was past. I was among people who were struggling, suffering more, struggling. So it expanded my view of the world. Jews have a very narrow view of the world now. One time we had a very big view of the world. But in our globalized world, Jews are not being taught and are not experiencing the world. And I did.
You have a quote here. the last sentence you say, Palestinians are no longer people with a political existence, but players in the drama of Jewish destiny. And the context for that is, could you elaborate on the issue of that history, whoever has power of any sort can create or reinvent history, what have you. Could you address that issue of power and history, and Palestinian is part of it? But
Well,
any history.
in the Jewish imagination, Palestine doesn't exist, Palestinians don't exist. We're there, we have a right to be there, and anyone who doesn't want us there is an anti-Semite. So it depoliticizes our conquering of Palestine, and it depoliticizes their struggle against that conquering. So we take the politics out of it, and we see it as a moral struggle which they have no claim on from the Jewish perspective. Now, Jews of conscience see it differently.
What about the past? I had asked you this before in terms of the power to tell a story. The Gypsies, for example, I brought that up before. The Gypsies have their story, and they argue that it's the Roma. They argue that theirs is quite parallel in terms of the Holocaust with the Jewish story. But I interviewed a couple Roma who were on the Holocaust Council, but the issue of power comes up again, power to tell history. Could you
Right.
address that?
Well, Jews have always told history. The Bible is a very interesting telling of history. Jews are at the center, or the people Israel are at the center. Well, the peoples of that region and that time period probably didn't think Jews were at the center, but we did. Again, there's nothing wrong with that understanding of being at the center, as long as you don't have power to promulgate that story as a way of unaccountability. So yes, Jews have always felt that they're at the center of history. Fine. But don't oppress other peoples.
Could you address this issue of Jewish power? What do you? And that's a controversial, the ADO will be on your case, or anybody talk about that on it. Could you elaborate on the issue of whatever that is?
Well, there's Jewish power around every corner in the United States, and it's exercised to keep this narrative of innocence and redemption, suffering, the common narrative. And the Holocaust, in many ways, is taught in that way. But there are Jews of conscience, who are fighting that power, not because it's Jewish only, but because it's skewing toward injustice, and Jews of conscience want Jews to be just. Okay, we're coming to the end, because I've got to go.
Okay, you say, we are faced with the question of where Jewish power is leading us. Could Jewish leaders, heeding the lessons of the Holocaust, be leading us down the brink of another, perhaps prouder destruction? You said that.
Well, Israel's a very dangerous place to live. And it's dangerous because of the way it was formed, and it's dangerous because of the way it's acting. So, in one sense, Israel is supposed to secure our security as Jews, but it also may be endangering it. Jews of conscience are trying to figure a way where Jews are not endangered and are not endangering others.
A couple more, or do you have time for that?
Yeah, what time is it? Because I'm also getting tired.
You talked about, this is intriguing, as I traveled the country and around the world, I met more than a few Christians who felt that the ecumenical dialogue had muzzled them. They resented the center of the dialogue that saw criticism of Israeli policy as a reason for accusations of anti-Semitism. Christian ecumenical dialogue participants felt keenly the need to silence the anti-Semite. Could you elaborate on the kind of complaint you ran across in your travels?
Well, the complaint is that the Holocaust does not speak to the contemporary situation of Jews, and the way Israel is presented does not speak to the contemporary reality of Jews. And Christians want to speak to that reality as they are spoken to about their reality. By the way, Christianity has also changed in large part, partly because of the Holocaust. They're more global, they're more interested in justice issues, and Jews say, fine, just stay out of the Middle East. Christians aren't staying out of the Middle East.
You have Desmond Tutu, as in your book, he introduces it, there's a quote, he's been accused of anti-Semitism, and he says this: people are scared in this country, the United States, to say wrong is wrong because the Jewish lobby is very powerful, and he's taking a lot of heat for that. Could you elaborate on that? A man of his stature.
Well, a man of his stature is being pummeled by the Jewish establishment, and you'd ask why. Maybe he's African, maybe that's the reason. Maybe he's too interested in Palestinian rights. I mean, Nobel laureates with a moral message, and certainly Desmond Tutu has one, are often heralded. But in the Jewish community, when you speak on the Palestinians in a positive way, you're not heralded, and you're accused of anti-Semitism. But again, among Jews of conscience, Desmond Tutu was held up in high regard.
Could you address the neocon movement? And a lot of those guys are Jewish, and a lot of those people are former leftists, and they've migrated. Could you discuss that movement?
Well, this happened in the 70s and 80s, maybe even in the 60s, where Jews on the left or Jews who were liberal moved more and more toward a conservative or neoconservative position. The whole Jewish community was moving there. And that's why one of the reasons I wrote my book, Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. I wanted to figure that out. But if you see the Holocaust as innocent suffering and to be held in a kind of religious place, and Israel is innocent when people are saying that Israel isn't innocent, and you want the United States to guarantee Israel's security, you don't want radical leftist Jews criticizing American or Israeli imperialism. So the retreat into neoconservatism had to do with Israel and the Holocaust and Jewish identity.
You talk about the mandate, you quote, the mandate of teaching the Holocaust in school curricula. By the time Christian students reach my university Holocaust class, they have read Elie Wiesel's Night at least once, often twice, sometimes 3 times. Would you elaborate on that whole issue of prepping people to have a sense?
Well, I think that has to do with the power of Jewish discourse to have mandated in schools classes about the Holocaust. And I think the Holocaust should be studied. I've studied it my whole life. But I don't want state mandates. And you have to ask yourself again how that functions. Why state mandates? And I think it's a way of enshrining a certain kind of Jewish identity.